We're going to have a little bit of a scheduling struggle here. We've got some votes at 2:30, and I think we'll try and keep the hearing going as best as possible, depending on what members we have that can maybe fill the chairs. But again, this hearing is all brought about by the revelations last week. I got a call from the commissioner of the IRS informing me of the it's not necessarily a breach, I guess you could call it a breach, but not your standard cyber attack that we've been talking about. This is just simply a breach of confidentiality in a system that's meant to assist taxpayers, and it brought all kinds of questions to mind. I mean, what type of authentication system, what kind of security system is being utilized here, not only within the IRS, but also other agencies within the government, and what we're starting to find out is, well, different agencies, the Social Security Administration, we have the CMS with healthcare.gov, similar types of systems. I know the IRS now has shut down the Get Transcript program. These are some serious issues that we need to address. Because we are short on time, I'll have my opening statement entered in the record without objection.
Without objection.
Senator Carper is generally pretty good about that. But again, these are serious issues. Because we had the compromise of about 100,000 taxpayer Get Transcript accounts. The IRS has already tracked that we've had about 13,000 questionable tax returns filed, and that's, of course, why the hackers are doing this, is to get the information to quickly file a tax return to, with good information so it's not flagged by the IRS, so they can claim tax refunds and obtain those before the taxpayer whose identity has been stolen even know about it. And according to my briefing here, about $39 million have already been transferred from the IRS to those criminals. And we don't know how much more widespread this would be, not only in the IRS, but also Social Security, CMS, other, CFPB. We've got a lot of questions that this is just the beginning hearing to get to the bottom of. But with that, I'll turn it over to our ranking member, Senator Carper. I'll start the questioning with Dr. Fu or Mr. Greene, whoever can answer the question. Where does the IRS obtain the information they use for the knowledge-based authentication? I mean, where's all the data coming from?
So I'm not entirely familiar with IRS obtains its data. I am familiar of sister sites where they obtain their data.
Okay, go ahead. I mean, I just want to know where most people obtain this, because this is all commercially available, correct?
Correct. The private sector offers services for this instant KBA. For instance, one provider, Experian, is used by some federal sites to do exactly the same kind of purpose as the Get Transcript. For instance, the Social Security Administration.
Again, where does Experian get all the data from?
I believe they obtain it from credit reports and other financial data. Anybody
else want to add to that? Go ahead, Mr. Greene.
On the IRS site, if you have an Equifax credit freeze, then they can't. Sorry. On the IRS website, if you have an Equifax credit freeze, they cannot, they will not get asked the questions, which makes me suspect it might come from Equifax for the IRS.
Okay, again, what I'm trying to get at is where do the data mining companies obtain the information from? And where is that every time you click on an app, agree to their privacy contracts or whatever of applications, the cookies? In other words, there's a constant flow of information and personal identifiable information when we're all using our iPhones and our mobile devices, correct?
Sure. The individual app will depend upon what's in the end user license agreement. There are data aggregators whose business is to aggregate data from whatever sources and to sell it. And as Dr. Fu said, a lot of it is available from credit reports and elsewhere. So the data aggregators put that together and they use that. And most, whether government or private companies that use KBA, use one of the credit bureaus or some similar type of data aggregator for their KBA services.
Well, what I'd like to do, because I think, Dr. Fu, you've been prepped for this, we've got a chart here, four questions in terms of, this was taken from the healthcare.gov website, in terms of the authentication we're talking about here. Can you, let's just go through, and can you describe for the audience and for the members here exactly how easy this is to defeat with very limited information or knowledge? I mean, the first question is, please select the county for the address you provided.
Right. So I think some context is important. This is the screen presented for the instant KBA. You get 4 questions about your personal finances to answer. But before you get to this page, you first have to enter your name, your social security number, and your address. So the adversary who has already reached this stage already has quite a bit of personal information. So for instance, if you already know the address of the taxpayer, it's very easy to figure out where the taxpayer lives in what county.
So not a real challenge. Second question, according to our records, you previously lived in Pickwick. Please choose the city from the following list where the street is located.
Yes. So in this particular case, you could rule out streets that make no sense in the particular address of the taxpayer and basically have a very good chance of getting the correct answer.
Number 3, please select the city you've previously resided in.
Right. So because these are culled from financial records, and if the adversary does have access to breach data, this will be readily available.
And according to our records, you graduated from which of the following high schools?
Right. So it's with Facebook accounts today, it's fairly trivial to figure out what high school somebody goes to. Moreover, if one of your friends posts something about you and you can figure out their high school, there you have it as well.
And again, when we go back to just these recently highly publicized cyber attacks, where all this PII has been mined, for earlier witness, I can't remember which one, said about 1 billion individuals with their PII compromised within the criminal networks. This is kind of information that a criminal would have, and they would basically have all this information already, correct? Because it's the exact same information that these data mining companies are already obtaining. So you have a perfect match of the information that the data mining companies are using with the information that's been criminally obtained through these attacks. Is that roughly correct?
Roughly correct, yeah. As more PII is stolen, the effectiveness of the KBA is going to go down, and that you need to look at other steps you can still use KBA as part of a security procedure, but there are new steps, there are additional steps you could put in place to try to raise the level of security there. And Mr. Kasper mentioned it, you out-of-band communication like that mail. So you go through these steps, you get to the end of it, instead of saying, okay, we now know you're Jeff Greene, it says we're going to send a piece of mail to Jeff Greene's address with a PIN number or some identifying number. And that would make it much more difficult for the criminals because that relies on the known address.
So again, the point of this is all very, so if a criminal has all that personal information, they've got all this information already, basically. So this is very easy for them to accomplish what they did with the IRS, correct?
Yeah.
Obviously, it's pretty simple because they attempted 200,000 accounts and they got into 100,000.
Correct, yeah, on an individual level, yes.
Mr. Kasper, I'd like to just have you describe your frustration in trying to deal with the IRS once you understood, which, by the way, this was your case was first published at what, March 15th?
Well, March 30th. I think it was March 30th.
Okay, but again, it was somewhat publicized. I know we've got either further testimony and discussions with the IRS. They were fully aware of this, and yet they made a decision to continue with this type of authentication.
I remember Brian Krebs said that Tig2Web was a frequent visitor to his site in his referrers when he posted the article. So I think Tig2 was aware. But.
So again, just describe to us, kind of tell your story in terms of when you found out about this and you started contacting the IRS, how they responded.
Yeah, it was frustrating not being able to find out who had stolen my information because I didn't know how they had gotten it. I didn't know if there was a virus on my computer. I didn't know if someone had stolen something from my home. I didn't know how the information had gotten out there. And there was nothing that I could do about it other than wait 6 months. I went to my local IRS office. They said, we can't help you. They literally, couldn't give me any more information now that I had reported as fraud.
Did they give you any reason why they couldn't help you further?
They said privacy rules. At every step of the case, when I tried to get more information, they would say privacy rules prevent them from doing that when the person who they were protecting had already taken advantage of my privacy. So,
okay, well, we'll have the commissioner here in the next panel, so we'll ask him exactly what those privacy rules are. Senator Carp, Mr. Michael Kasper, in his closing comments, talked about a gentleman named John Valentine. I believe he must be working for the Utah Department of Revenue that apparently had contacted the IRS in February of this year. Talking about seeing returns with prior years' information very close, basically looked like fraudulent returns. Were you aware of that, or were you, Mr. Millholland?
Well, we were aware, obviously, the difficulties with filings that basically took place in a number of states, including Utah and Wisconsin and others, in January, had a symptom identified with them, and that is that they had access to the prior year's return. Those returns primarily were filed only at the state, not at the federal level. But it was out of that concern that I pulled together the what's called the Security Summit in March to pull everybody together to say, okay, what's going on, and most importantly, what can we do together that we can't do separately? So we were aware of that situation, and we have been working with the states and with the private sector since then.
And then you were aware of Mr. Kasper's situation then. I guess Krebs on Security had a blog posting on 30th of March.
Yes.
You were aware of that personally as well as the IRS was?
Yes, we were, and in fact, as we've been tracking back through everything, we had I am not allowed to talk about particular taxpayers, but as a general matter, let me just say that we took all of that information into consideration and were in the process in April beginning to take a look at adjustments, made some adjustments already during the filing season to issues around Get Transcript. And in fact, we're developing and are developing with the states a protocol that will in fact improve the security significantly as we go forward. But we won't put the site back up until we're confident with its security.
But you were aware at the end of March, but you decided not to make any changes at that point in time.
I know we made some changes, which I'd be happy to talk to you about more privately, but we did not change the fundamental security aspect of Get Transcript. Our plan was to take a look at that and roll it out toward the middle or the end of June.
And then you were made aware of the actual breach of a couple 100,000, well, 100,000, but an attempt on 200,000 different accounts on about May 18th. Is that correct?
It would have been about May 18th. Okay. It was mid-May when we thought it was a denial of service, and then on Thursday, someplace around here, I know where that date is. I can tell you for sure.
Okay, but then about a week or so later, 2 weeks later, you decided to shut down.
Actually, we knew there was a denial of service attack on May 14th. Or we suspected that. We then knew, and I was advised by Thursday, May 21st, that in fact there had been, it's less than a week ago, 10 days ago, I was advised that there had been a breach. We continued to investigate that. We provided we'd already notified Homeland Security and other security people, as well as the Inspector General. And then the following Tuesday, it was the Memorial Day weekend. As we got more details and knew what we were dealing with, we made an announcement to the public and started mailing out letters.
Okay, and you shut down the site then with how many days?
And we shut down the site probably on Tuesday or Wednesday.
Thursday morning.
Was it, I guess the Thursday morning before the meeting with me, they had shut down the site.
So within a week or so, something like that? Okay.
From the time there was an indication of a problem until the time, which was originally thought to be a security problem, until the site was taken down was a week.
Okay. Mr. Kasper was talking about his frustration that he'd contacted the IRS and couldn't get any information on this, that it'd take about 6 months. And there's always privacy concerns where that was the reason why the IRS couldn't give him more information. Can you talk about, why would it take 6 months? What are those privacy laws you're dealing with that you couldn't communicate with the taxpayer whose identity has been stolen through an IRS system? Why the timeline? What are those privacy laws that prevent the IRS?
Privacy laws that we're concerned about, and as the Senator Ayotte had raised issues with us, is Section 6103 says we cannot reveal to anyone any taxpayer information. We can't share it with other even government agencies unless there's a statutory exception that allows us to do that. So the challenge we had when taxpayer information, fraudulent returns were filed, first you have to determine who's the fraudster and who's the legitimate taxpayer. Secondly, there was a concern that if we issued a copy even of a fraudulent return, it could have other taxpayer information that had been stolen in that return, and technically it's a criminal violation for us to reveal that. I don't know why it took anybody 6 months. It should never take you 6 months to get through the system, but basically what we've set up is a situation where we can simply redact any third-party information in a return and give the taxpayer a copy of the fraudulent return so they'll know exactly what was in there.
And how long a time do you think that process should take then?
That process, we have a special hotline for identity theft, and we should be, if you get a notice that you've been returned, there's no reason you shouldn't be able to get a copy of that return promptly.
Promptly means?
So promptly within, if you call us, I don't know why you couldn't have that return within a week.
Okay. We had, in Wisconsin, the Gutenbergs had their identity stolen quite a few years ago. Again, the IRS could not, even though they knew there were fraudulent returns, they understood there was identity theft. They were prevented, again, under apparently that same privacy statute, from contacting the Gutenbergs. And as a result, they continue to have their identity being stolen and victims of that. I've introduced a piece of legislation. It is called the Social Security Identity Defense Act 2015 to allow you to provide that information of identity theft. Is that a piece of legislation you'll support?
We would be delighted to be able to. We work, our biggest problem, for instance, with law enforcement, is when there's been identity theft, we can't give the law enforcement authorities that information without the approval of the taxpayer involved. So to the extent that for law enforcement purposes, for protection against identity theft, we're allowed to provide information to either law enforcement authorities or others who need to know to prevent further identity theft, that would be helpful.
Mr. Millholland, I'm actually surprised that having noticed, found out about this breach on May 18th, you already know that there have been 13,000 fraudulent returns filed from those same breached accounts, and $39 million of tax refunds have been sent to those criminals. I mean, how did the IRS get that information so quickly?
Part of our analysis was to go in and look at every one of these attempts and see what they were doing and such, and thus the mapping process, the data analysis process of taking each one of these emails, tracking down what domains those emails were going to, determining how many Social Security numbers had different email addresses. All of that then were worked so we could block those particular Social Security numbers from getting any more information. But it also allowed us then to go dive into the IRS master file and associated systems to say, all right, how many of these people actually filed returns? How many of them didn't file returns? As the Commissioner provided some numbers on that. That has led us down to this approximate 13,000 that may or may not be fraudulent. We're not sure yet.
As long as we're talking about those emails, so you had that two-step authentication that required the criminals to get another, a signal from, or a text or an email to that account. Did those have to be separate email accounts? Is there, go ahead.
I'm sorry.
For those again, the 100,000 accounts were successfully breached. That was a two-step process. Did those have to be separate email accounts? Were they separate email accounts?
They didn't have to be. It was one of the design flaws.
So, okay, so that is a design flaw.
Absolutely.
Okay.
But a part of our problem is because we don't communicate with taxpayers yet electronically, so we never send emails back or forth because we have no security for them. If we could, as part of our development and refinement of our systems, be able to communicate electronically, it would accomplish a lot of goals, one of which would be the two-factor authentication then would be much more significant. In financial institutions, others, when you want to change your password, they send you a key to your email address because they know it's your email address. Right now, we don't know.
That's a relatively significant flaw and a pretty easy fix that, each email in terms of this authentication has got to be a unique email, correct?
That would be going forward is absolutely correct.
Okay, so I mean, that is a corrective item that needs to be done almost immediately.
Yes,
Mr. Millholland, knowing that this authentication process is being used by healthcare.gov, Social Security Administration, other agencies within the federal government, have any of those agencies or departments been in contact with you to discuss what happened with the IRS, and are they considering shutting down their sites?
I cannot speak to whether they're shutting down or not, but we have had conversations with, just most recently this last Friday with Social Security Administration on what do they do to authenticate. So that kind of conversation is going on there. In addition, we've had, although it's been a bit of time, with the VA. Again, how do they authenticate? So I'll call best practices amongst government is much better known.
So healthcare.gov, CMS, HHS has not been in contact with you in terms of their authentication and their concern about similar type of breach of their system?
Not with me, perhaps with other parts of the IRS, but not with me.
Okay, I would like to find out whether they have. I think that's pretty serious. I can't read my own writing. Government agency. Okay, we talked about that. You guys have anything?
Perhaps the budget question
Nah. Yeah, I do know that, Mr. Commissioner, you did mention budget cuts as one of the potential problems, but this really had nothing to do with budget cuts, correct?
In my testimony, as I've said, this issue was not a budget issue. I've tried to make that clear all along. I don't want anybody to think, while we have significant budget challenges, I don't want anybody to think that every problem we have is a budget problem. There are issues and challenges we have that are management questions. There are other issues. Our problem here for the budget is not fixing the authentication on this side. Our challenge for the budget is, in fact, upgrading and protecting our entire system, which is at this point secure, but under continual attack.
Mr. Millholland, in this knowledge-based authentication, you're using an outside vendor to provide you this type of information, correct? That was from healthcare.gov, but yours is very similar, correct?
We use a third-party source for information beyond the type of questions that, if someone called, they're asked a series of questions. Then we go to these out-of-wallet questions to a credit scoring agency.
Again, but that taxpayer personal identifiable information, that's not held within the IRS anywhere, correct? That's all held by an outside vendor?
That's correct. That's correct.
Is there any personal information that the IRS stores that isn't obtained by the IRS directly from the taxpayer? Do you go to any outside vendor anywhere in the IRS to store and then store it within the IRS's system?
I don't believe so, but possibly criminal CI, maybe?
Yeah, that's a good one. That's a good catch. As a general matter, we have no personal information from people that they haven't provided us. The Criminal Investigation Division does, in its investigations pursuing criminal cases, accumulate data and information that they go after. If we do an audit of someone, an examination where we're actually examining their records, we may accumulate information about demonstrating whether they're following the tax laws. But even that is not in a database that the IRS is keeping on individuals. The only data we have in our major database is the information that comes from filing of taxes.
Okay, and again, that's simply on a case-by-case basis, that type of information.
That's right. Both the investigations and the examination are just on case-by-case pursuit of particular issues.
Is the IRS in any kind of analytics utilizing information from credit card companies? Mr. Millholland or Mr.
Yes.
Commissioner?
Well, yeah, we basically, under statute provided by Congress, as individuals, we all at the end of the year get a credit card summary of your expenses. We get on what's called the 1099-K, we get that information for all merchants. So for the first time in history, we have third-party information about what small, medium-sized, even larger businesses are doing as far as credit card receipts. So that comes in. Then we have to decide what to make of it, because all it tells us is what the credit card receipts are. Now, they're really out of it. Small businesses are filing returns with less revenues than their credit card receipts, so those are sort of low-hanging fruit. But beyond that, we don't know what their expenses are. More importantly, we don't know what their cash receipts are. So that data needs to be analyzed. We need to try to figure out what do we know as a result of that data. How can we begin to model what an average business in a certain industry in a certain area ought to look like based on the data we're getting out of those credit cards. And it does, we think the biggest part of the tax gap is estimated $135 billion of underreporting by small, medium-sized, some large businesses. And this is the first time we've ever had third-party information. So there's a significant amount of data analytics around that information.
Are you getting individual transaction information? Or are you just getting summary of?
We're getting summary data. You know, it's obviously voluminous. It's the result of a year's transactions. We don't know what an individual bought, whether they bought, you know, had their car washed or had it serviced or whatever else, what we're getting is, in fact, the receipts there. This many credit cards, this many dollars in funding provided to that organization.
So is this kind of akin to a 1099 then? You're using this, so you can trace the fact that if it's a small business who's obviously receiving revenue through credit cards,
Yes.
you're matching what that business has reported for income versus the
The
credit
summary
card
amount,
information.
exactly.
So that's what this is being used for.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. Mr. Millholland, I see that you used to be a Chief Technology Officer of Visa International. Is there any government agency taking a look at individual transactions from the credit card companies that you're aware of?
Not that I'm aware of, no.
So, because we do hear that CFPB, the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, is looking at individual transactions and trying to come up with, for some purpose.
Again, not to my knowledge, sir.
Okay. Senator Carper, do you have further questions? Okay. Thank you. Closing questions, and we'll give you an opportunity to make some final comments. Mr. Millholland, when you were setting this thing up, considering it in 2013 before you set up in 2014, did you ever review and take a look at utilizing for that second, the second step, using a phone number or some identifier from an actual tax return?
No, there were a number of options we considered as we were looking at how do you know this is the person, if you like. Some of that information was considered. I can't remember all the factors, so to speak, but we really came down to say, let's use this out-of-wallet approach with a third party. That seemed to be where the energy was, and it was like more believable and such, that these credit scoring agencies would have a lot more information about the individual than we would. And thus, that's what we basically focused on.
We did have Dr. Fu go through that list of questions and just pretty well show how incredibly easy it is to have that information, particularly in light of the fact that we know we've got 1 billion people whose identity has been compromised, and all that information with Social Security numbers is readily available. I mean, did you factor that in? And
it was factored in the following way. Yes, of the ease of use of the system for the taxpayer versus our confidence level, at least equivalent to the phone, if somebody had called in, that this is the person who they say it would be. I previously remarked that, of course, in hindsight, we hadn't thought about the mass attack like this. We had thought of individuals coming in to try to fake it, but not the mass. And, frankly speaking, that's one of the mistakes we made in this.
Now, I appreciate the fact that the IRS has taken the decision to shut this site down because of the danger, the risk to taxpayers of losing even more information. Are you surprised that none of the other government agencies that are using this haven't made that same decision?
I really cannot comment on how they balance their risks. The whole cyberspace, so to speak, or these kind of applications, you always are making trade-offs of risks. How risky is it versus the benefit you're getting from it? So they say 23 million taxpayers got their transcript successfully. That's a tremendous saving in productivity for them, and of course a cost savings for the IRS.
Yes, but the IRS has made a decision because of the risk to taxpayers. What about Social Security Administration? What about CMS with healthcare.gov? I mean, okay, I can understand decisions being made and thinking this would be secure enough. Now we know it is not secure enough. It's highly vulnerable. And I'll ask you, Mr. Commissioner, are you surprised that, and have you been contacted by any of these other secretaries or department heads or agency heads in terms of the decision you made, and are they mulling the same decision?
We've had enough visibility with this issue that I would assume that everybody is, but I have not been contacted. And as Mr. Millholland said, they're all dealing with a whole set of unique circumstances and challenges in their agencies, and I'm confident they will continue to make the right decisions. And if they need information from us, we obviously communicate and provide security information across the government.
So
But at
you-
this point, I don't know what they're doing, and there's no way I can second guess what they should be doing or what they have been doing.
So you have not been contacted by Sylvia Burwell or there, so none of the other agencies that are using this have contacted you directly to just talk about, your experience, kind of ask you the questions I'm asking, and talk about the decision you made?
And none of them have and none of them at the technical level either.
Okay, well, if they're watching here, I'd highly recommend that they get in touch with both of you gentlemen and start, thinking very long and hard about whether or not they ought to be taking their websites down or changing this very quickly. Mr. Millholland, how quickly would you be able to set up a new authentication system with multiple steps that would be more secure?
The question literally comes down to how should we extend the multi-factor approach into this application, and at what level of confidence do we want to have that the person is who they say they are? This will range from work that we already have initiated. As I say, we're still doing the analysis of what happened and such. We've got to settle this 13,000 clump of taxpayers right now. But then present the options and debate it inside. But I suspect that we'll be bringing a decision to the commissioner before the end of June of here's the investments we think we now want to make in hardening this. And then that will go through a process of decision-making, probably involve externals.
Do you believe, how many months do you think it'll take you to actually implement increased security and be up and running again? Yeah, do you have any kind of outside estimate? I'm not going to hold you to it. I just kind of, is this months, or is this going to be dragging into 2016?
The way I would answer it is to provide reasonable level that it is, the people are who they say they are. Reasonable is in the eye of the beholder, actually in this beholder, that we think this person is who they think they are with this level of confidence. Here's what it'll take to do that. It may involve things like, hey, if you're asking for a transcript, maybe we ought to have you use your credit card. Another form of authentication, charge you $1 or whatever, so that at least we now have that additional piece of information about you. All those things can be done, I'll say, in a straightforward way. Certainly, we'll do this before the next filing season.
Will you be, through a third-party vendor, will you be able to access a beefed-up security system other than this, or is this going to be something that you're going to have to use a third-party vendor and implement something within your own software system?
My leaning right now today is beef up the use of the tools that are already available from the out-of-wallet provider. There are a number of technology things we can do, like, for example, the the IP address of the person that made the request. Are they now switching devices when they make a second request? That kind of information is known. And a number of other, I'll just say, technology approaches that are available from that third party. In addition, there are the other choices we have from a technology view. What kind of blocks do we want to put on this? As I said earlier, you only get one email address with one social security number, if you like. That has consequences. They say, well, suppose the person wants to change the address. How easy do we make that? And all of those what-ifs, unfortunately, Mr. Chairman, increases cost and the complexity of the solution we want to put out. In any case, I think we'll be able to make significant hardening of this particular application certainly before the next filing season.
So were those capabilities to harden this security available from the third-party vendor when you were going through this in 13? Are these new capabilities, or was it primarily just a cost decision that it hardened our capability, but it's going to cost too much?
I frankly do not remember all the technology capabilities that this particular third party had at the time. I do know that when we made considerations of the trade-offs was keeping it easy, like it was on the telephone, versus adding this additional layer of questions and complexity. And that was frank and vigorous exchange of views inside the agency about how we ought to do that.
Let me just add, what is the cost of this outside vendor for this application?
I believe, I think it was around 10 cents per transaction to get per question. I'm not 100% positive about that.
That's how, it's a per question cost.
Right.
So that thing right there costs 40 cents. And if you have 23 million accessing this.
It's clearly one of these things that is negotiable with the particular suppliers. You could say a bundle of questions could be X amount. All those go into the contract negotiations and such, versus the cost of, well, suppose you just kept it the normal way, and let's say we mailed you your tax return. That's 40 or 50 cents to do that.
Mm-hmm.
So all those go into those trade-off decisions of benefit versus the risks. And that's going to be one of the things we have to weigh as we decide how hardened do we want this?
Mr. Kasper, in his testimony, said that when he contacted the IRS and talked about the fact that somebody already filed a tax return on that, that the IRS did react by saying that there was something suspicious about about the address being used by the criminal. Do you know what that was? I mean, and can you?
In Mr. Kasper's case, no, I do not.
Were those addresses used? Were those easily identifiable as Russian, or were they, were there addresses in the U.S., but somehow you're able to?
There were.
I'm going to say the IG has asked us not to speculate in public about where the domains were set up. There were domains that were set up for this purpose relatively recently, and we'd be delighted to give you that information off the record.
Okay. That's really all the questions I have. I'm happy to give you gentlemen opportunity to make a final comment before we close the hearing.
I appreciate that, Mr. Chairman. First, as I said to start my testimony, this is a serious issue. We take it seriously. Protecting taxpayers and their information is a high priority for us, in many ways the highest priority. This is, as I said, in many ways a shot across the bow. The issue we're dealing with here, critical to the taxpayers whose accounts were accessed, is about a web access, web program we have that doesn't have anything to do with our system. But as I say, we increasingly over the last 3 or 4 years have seen that more and more of the identity theft we're seeing, more and more of the attacks we're seeing are coming from organized crime and syndicates around the world. So it is, as I fondly say, no longer beanbag. We are actually in the middle of a war with very sophisticated, well-funded, intelligent enemies. And so the challenge for us all, and it's not just a problem for the IRS, it's not just a problem for government agencies, it's obviously a problem for everyone in the financial services industry, everyone who has data, financial or otherwise, on people, to try to figure out how to battle this most effectively. So to some extent, it's a question of funding for how do we make sure our system is secure across the board as we go. But it's not just a question of money, it's also a question of just a continual attempt to assess where you are and where you're going. So we should always assume that we have to get better, which means as we get better over time, we'll always be better than we were in the past. The system of auto-wallet authentication, already 22% of taxpayers can't answer their own questions. In some cases, it means that the criminals are better able at answering the questions in some cases than the taxpayers. So it's Mr. Millholland's point. You're always doing that balancing act of, do you make it inaccessible to taxpayers and increase the burden, and at what cost? Clearly, I think that with all of the breaches that have gone on, as I noted, I think it's hard to remember what I've noted here and earlier today, the IRS was 1 breach out of 25 in the month of May across the world. So clearly, we're dealing with unknown and volumes of information out there that dwarf anything we could imagine. So we're going to continually, I think, have to assume that we're at risk. It's what we assume in our normal day and out with our security for the overall cybersecurity issue of our system, is to assume that we're at risk. So even as we harden this program and put it back up, and we won't put it back up until we feel comfortable with it, even then we'll run on the assumption that we're at risk, and we need to do that. And I think that's the only way we're going to be able to continue to make progress. But it is not a simple problem. It's a complex one. That is going to take the best efforts of everyone, and that's why we're delighted to have what I think is going to turn out to be a very successful partnership as a result of the security summit we put together with the private sector, because we all agreed We can do a lot more together, working with various levels and layers of authentication and protection than any group, whether it's the private sector, the states, or the IRS by themselves can do. And that's what we're committed to doing going forward.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Commissioner. Mr. Millholland.
I have no closing
comment?
remarks.
Okay.
Thank you, though.
I would like to ask consent to enter into the record 2 articles, Krebs on security and NextGov, other agencies use same logon procedures as exploited IRS site. Without objection, so ordered. I want to thank both of you for your thoughtful testimony and your answers to our questions. Mr. Commissioner, I would ask that you take a serious look at the Social Security Identity Defense Act of 2015. I think it really would be a very helpful piece of legislation to allow, actually require the IRS, when you are made aware of the fact that identity theft has occurred, that you'll notify the taxpayer as well as federal authorities so they can track down the criminal. And we can end those types of activities. So if you could look at that, I'd appreciate you working with our staff. Hopefully you can be supportive of that. With that, the hearing record will remain open for 15 days until June 17th at 5 p.m. for the submission of statements and questions for the record. This hearing is adjourned.